Now I'll tell you a story. Every time I tell it, I'm shocked. I'd always considered myself lucky. My life had lined up perfectly: a stable career, a beautiful wife named Wanda, and two precious twin daughters who had become the light of my world. My business was thriving, allowing me to build a comfortable life for us. Wanda and I lived in a spacious home in a friendly neighborhood, and I'd built this life through years of hard work, determination, and commitment. I was proud of what we had together. But it all changed on the afternoon of my daughter's second birthday party. We decided to throw a big celebration and invite friends, family, and neighbors to mark the occasion. The whole house buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the happy chaos of kids running around, tearing open presents, and playing. It was everything I'd wanted in life, until, in a split second, my world began to crack. I'd just finished freshening up in the bathroom and was making my way back to the party when I overheard my mother and aunt talking quietly in the hallway. They hadn't noticed me coming up behind them, and I paused, hearing my mother's voice in a tone that made me stop cold. "I just can't understand where those blue eyes came from," she whispered to my aunt, clearly talking about my twins. "Well, have you asked Michael about it?" my aunt replied, clearly concerned. "Oh, God, no," my mother replied, sounding almost frantic. "I can't imagine how he'd react if he found out they might not be his. He's so happy with them." Their words hit me like a punch to the gut. My own mother thought there was a chance those girls, the two little girls I'd adored from the moment they were born, might not be mine. I felt like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. I ducked back into the bathroom, clutching the edge of the sink as I tried to catch my breath. I wanted to dismiss it as some absurd misunderstanding, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and I couldn't unhear those words. In that moment, a surge of anger and confusion washed over me, but I knew better than to let it show. Whatever was going on, I had to find out the truth without alerting Wanda or causing a scene. So, I pulled myself together, took a deep breath, and rejoined the party. Smiling and laughing with everyone, I kept up appearances, but inside, I was reeling, questioning everything I thought I knew. That night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, I lay in bed next to Wanda, trying to piece together what I'd heard. I couldn't bring myself to confront her, not without proof. I knew I had to investigate on my own terms, quietly and thoroughly, without tipping her off. If Wanda had betrayed me, I would need to know the full extent. The next morning, I began planning my next moves. I'd need DNA tests, information, and a way to access Wanda's life beyond the facade she'd shown me. As painful as it was to start this process, I knew it was the only way to uncover the truth without her catching on. What I didn't know was just how much my life was about to change. The morning after the party, I knew I couldn't ignore what I'd overheard. The doubts clawed at me, making every moment with Wanda feel forced, every smile a calculated act. As much as I wanted to shake it off as paranoia, I couldn't ignore that nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I needed answers, and I needed them now. After a few days of weighing my options, I decided to hire a private investigator. I found someone discreet, experienced, and professional, a man who understood the sensitivity of my situation and promised he could dig up the truth without raising suspicion. It didn't take long for the PI to get to work, tracking Wanda's daily routine, her messages, her calls, and all the digital footprints she'd unknowingly left behind. I authorized him to dig as deep as he needed to, and he did. While he worked, I turned my focus to the DNA tests. It felt surreal, swabbing my own daughters for evidence that might shatter everything I believed. I kept telling myself it was all routine, that maybe it was nothing, but as the days dragged on, I found myself hoping for something, anything, that would explain the unexplainable. In the quiet moments, my mind churned, playing over memories of our marriage, searching for signs of betrayal I might have missed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the PI called me back to his office. The moment I saw his face, I knew. He sat me down and handed me a folder, explaining that the tests confirmed my worst fears: the girls weren't mine. And that wasn't all. He'd found records, messages, and evidence of a years-long affair Wanda had hidden behind my back. I don't remember much of what he said after that. His words blended together, each one cutting deeper than the last. I felt like my life was crumbling before my eyes. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd believed in, felt like a lie. Those girls I'd held in my arms since birth, who I thought carried a piece of me, weren't mine at all. The betrayal was complete. I'd given her everything, only to be left with nothing but lies. But as much as I wanted to confront her, to scream, to demand answers, I knew I couldn't let my emotions drive me. If I acted rashly, I'd risk everything. I needed to think strategically. So, instead of going home and confronting Wanda, I began putting a plan in place. My first step was to secure my finances. I started transferring assets, moving investments to accounts that only I could access. I even liquidated a portion of my business holdings, funneling the funds to secure locations she couldn't touch. Over the next several weeks, I quietly removed anything of value from the house. My personal belongings, family heirlooms, anything I didn't want to leave behind. I stored them safely, out of sight and out of reach. At night, I'd lie awake beside her, listening to her breathe, knowing each day brought me closer to a life without her. Through every step, I kept my face calm, my words light, even as I burned with resentment. I knew I couldn't make a move until everything was in place. Wanda didn't suspect a thing, and I intended to keep it that way until the day I was ready to reveal what I knew. I spent the following weeks carefully finalizing every last detail of my plan, tightening every loose end. Day by day, I moved more of my personal belongings out of the house, making excuses to bring boxes to storage or to drop off items at a friend's place for safekeeping. Wanda didn't seem to notice. If she did, she gave no sign, carrying on with life as if everything was fine, oblivious to the storm I was about to unleash. I worked with my attorney to prepare the divorce papers, ensuring everything was airtight. The papers would list her infidelity and provide concrete evidence, DNA results showing the twins weren't mine, records of her affair spanning years, and financial documents proving the extensive moves I'd made to safeguard my assets. The finality of it struck me more than once, but every time I felt a pang of regret, I reminded myself of her betrayal. Wanda's choices had taken away my family, my trust, and the life I'd built with her. This was justice, my justice. The day finally came, and I was ready. Wanda was out running errands when I coordinated with the server, ensuring she would be served as soon as she returned. I'd removed everything of mine from the house that morning, leaving no trace behind except the shell of our shared life. I even left my key on the kitchen counter, a silent farewell to the home we'd once shared. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a notification. The process server had left, and Wanda had been served. I took a deep breath, a strange mix of relief and finality settling over me. I pictured her expression as she read the papers, the shock, the disbelief, and finally, the crushing realization that her secrets had come to light. Part of me wished I could have seen her reaction, but another part of me knew it was better this way. Within hours, Wanda started calling. The ringing felt relentless as she tried to reach me, desperate to plead her case. I let the calls go unanswered, each one cementing my resolve. I wasn't about to let her manipulate me any further. Eventually, I listened to a few of her voicemails. Her voice trembled, pleading with me to talk, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, a mistake. But the proof was irrefutable. I had no need to hear her excuses. Days passed, and Wanda's calls turned into angry messages. She accused me of overreacting, of being cruel. Her desperation grew as she realized the full extent of what I'd done. I had cut her off from every financial asset we shared, secured my business interests, and left her with no access to my money. Her demands turned to pleas as she tried to reconcile, insisting that we could work things out for the girl's sake. But I knew those children weren't mine, and that chapter was closed. There was a strange satisfaction in watching Wanda's world crumble, knowing she was finally facing the consequences of the lies she'd built her life around. But there was sadness, too, a deep, hollow ache as I accepted that the life I'd cherished, the woman I'd loved, were gone. I realized then that betrayal isn't just a single act. It's a slow erosion, a theft of the dreams and plans you've invested in another person. As I looked around at the few remaining reminders of my old life, I felt a bittersweet relief. My heart was heavy, but my path was clear. The life I'd built with Wanda was over, but for the first time in months, I felt free to move forward. Wanda was relentless. No sooner had the papers been served than she lawyered up, filing every possible claim against me: child support, alimony, and even a demand for half of my business assets. She'd gone from begging to ruthless overnight, determined to salvage whatever she could. It was clear she was ready to take me to war, hoping the courts would side with her despite the evidence of her affair and the revelation that the twins weren't mine. But I was prepared. The first court date arrived sooner than I expected, and the reality of facing Wanda in person hit me hard. She was there, eyes red and voice steady, casting herself as the wounded party in front of the judge. I watched her, stunned by how effortlessly she slipped into the role of the devoted mother who'd been abandoned. Her attorney argued that, despite the circumstances, the twins had only known me as their father, and that it was my duty to continue supporting them. And then came the real blow. Her lawyer petitioned for Wanda to receive a significant share of my business and assets, claiming she had contributed to my success by maintaining the home. But I hadn't come unarmed. My own attorney laid out the truth, providing evidence of Wanda's years of infidelity and the proof that the twins weren't biologically mine. The judge, however, seemed unmoved, dismissing the infidelity as irrelevant to the financial obligations I supposedly had. Every argument my attorney made seemed to fall on deaf ears. The judge's sympathies were all with Wanda, painting her as the wrong spouse and me as the heartless man leaving her high and dry. It was infuriating, but I knew I had one ace up my sleeve: careful planning. I'd anticipated this and taken every possible precaution. My business assets had already been carefully shifted, tied up in trusts and offshore accounts that Wanda and her attorney couldn't reach. I'd restructured my finances to show limited income, creating a financial picture that showed I was nearly broke. By the time I was finished, even my primary business ownership appeared to be held by an entity outside of my direct control. I watched as her lawyer presented claims for half of a company that, legally, no longer belonged to me. The judge, clearly frustrated by her inability to access my assets, attempted to enforce temporary alimony and child support payments. But each demand met with resistance from my legal team, who meticulously presented the tangled financials, illustrating the impossibility of immediate compliance. I remained calm, respectful, and unmoved in court, giving the judge no excuse to penalize me directly. Week after week, Wanda's frustration grew as her requests for financial relief were blocked at every turn. Her lawyers tried different tactics, accusing me of hiding assets, even proposing that I'd manipulated the system. But the evidence of my bankruptcy and lack of income was sound, and no matter how they twisted it, they couldn't touch my hard-earned savings or investments. I was protected, shielded by the very system she tried to exploit. Seeing her desperation escalate gave me an odd sense of satisfaction. Wanda had expected me to roll over, to cave under pressure, and to keep funding the life she'd lived at my expense. But now, with her every attempt foiled, she was left exposed, her manipulations turning against her. I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication watching her scramble, finally held accountable for her betrayal. The battle wasn't over, but I could see her resolve starting to weaken. For once, the consequences were real, and she was forced to face them without me as her safety net. The courtroom battles and legal maneuvers had worn me down. Every hearing, every negotiation, every look at Wanda's face reminded me of the betrayal and bitterness that had replaced our once shared life. I'd won every financial battle, but the endless sparring left me feeling hollow. It was clear I needed a fresh start, somewhere far from the reminders of my old life and the person I could no longer be. It was over a quiet dinner with my cousin Howard and his wife, Cheryl, that I first voiced the idea. I mentioned wanting to leave it all behind, and they didn't hesitate. They knew as well as I did that starting anew might be the only way I'd truly move forward. Cheryl leaned across the table, a determined look in her eyes. "Let's make it happen, Michael. You deserve peace after all of this." That evening, we started making plans. First, I approached Julia, my lawyer and one of the few people who had stood by me through every phase of this ordeal. She understood my reasons immediately. She was a tactical mind, sharp and thorough, and she promised to handle the logistics so that my departure wouldn't leave any loose ends. Julia coordinated with Howard, helping me arrange the sale of my remaining assets and ensuring nothing tied me to my old life. Within weeks, the preparations were in motion. Julia discreetly filed my final paperwork, wrapping up everything left in my name, and Howard helped organize my escape route. We chose a quiet coastal town abroad, a place I'd never visited and where no one would have a reason to find me. It was all surreal, exchanging one life for another, but I felt more alive than I had in years. I was finally leaving behind the lies, the drama, and the painful memories. On a misty Sunday morning, with a single suitcase in hand, I said goodbye to Howard and Cheryl. We'd spent one last night together as a family, sharing stories, laughter, and a few tears. They promised to visit when things settled, and I knew I'd be waiting to welcome them when they did. I boarded a plane with nothing but the essentials, my heart lighter than it had been since the day I first discovered Wanda's betrayal. When I arrived in my new town, it felt like stepping into another world. The air smelled of salt water and fresh beginnings, the coastline stretching as far as the eye could see. The simple life felt right. I found a modest place near the water and settled into a quiet rhythm, working here and there, interacting with friendly locals, and savoring the feeling of peace. In the quiet moments, I reflected on everything I'd lost, everything I'd endured, and everything I'd gained. I'd traded in the dreams I'd once built with Wanda for a life that was entirely my own, free from deceit and pain. Bit by bit, I learned to embrace the solitude, to appreciate the simplicity, and to let go of the bitterness that had once consumed me. The betrayal had left scars, but I was finally free to live my life without looking over my shoulder. And in that newfound freedom, I found a sense of peace that made the journey worth it. The coastal town I'd settled into was a world away from the life I'd left behind. My days were quiet and unhurried, filled with small pleasures that I'd barely noticed before. I took up work with a local fishing crew, and after years of boardrooms and deadlines, the simplicity of hauling nets and watching the sunrise over the water felt like freedom. The locals welcomed me without question, accepting me as one of their own, and for the first time in years, I felt like I belonged somewhere. Here, I wasn't Michael, the betrayed husband or embattled businessman, I was simply myself. My new life had none of the drama, none of the endless tension that had haunted my days back home. Gradually, I started rebuilding my wealth, handling investments quietly and slowly, away from prying eyes. With no one looking over my shoulder, I was free to pursue my ambitions on my own terms, not to satisfy anyone else's expectations. It felt good to be in control again, to work and build something for myself, without the constant threat of betrayal lurking in the background. Occasionally, I heard from Howard or Julia, both of whom would check in to make sure I was doing well. They'd share news about Wanda, how the house had been foreclosed on and she'd moved back in with her parents, barely scraping by on the remnants of what she'd once taken for granted. She had lost her car, her savings, and the lifestyle she'd so eagerly fought for in court. From what I heard, her social circle had shrunk as well, and she was left to navigate her own mess, without me as a safety net. Hearing about Wanda's hardships stirred a strange mix of emotions. Part of me felt satisfaction, a sense of vindication knowing she was finally facing the consequences of her choices. But another part of me, buried deep, felt sympathy, too. We had once built a life together, after all. But as the years passed, any remaining anger or pity I felt toward her faded. Her life was her own, just as mine was now fully mine. Reflecting on the journey that had brought me here, I felt stronger than ever. I'd faced betrayal, heartache, and bitterness, but I'd found a way to rise above it. Moving on hadn't been easy, but it had taught me something invaluable. Sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that bring the most peace. I was finally free from the shadows of my past, and as I watched the waves roll in, I felt a deep, unwavering gratitude for the life I had reclaimed. In this new chapter, my life was my own, no longer tied to the pain of betrayal. Instead, I found peace in knowing I had taken control, left behind the bitterness, and embraced the freedom to shape my future, ready to move forward into whatever lay ahead.